You're going to be their husband. Apache Chief left 3 tall sisters in the rancher's barn. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The 3 sisters lived in a quiet, dusty town nestled on the edge of the Great Plains, where the wind swept across the fields in whispers and the sun set with a golden glow each evening. Their names were Clara, Grace, and Lily. Each one of them was unique, but they shared a common bond, a strong connection to their roots and a deep love for their land. The ranch they lived on had been passed down through generations, and they had grown up with the sound of cattle mooing in the distance and the smell of fresh hay in the barn. Despite their content life, there was a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. There had been whispers of something big coming their way, but none of them truly understood what it was. One morning, as the sisters worked under the hot sun, a shadow fell across the ranch. They looked up to see a tall, imposing figure standing at the edge of their property. The man's attire marked him as someone from a distant land, his weathered face betraying years of experience and wisdom. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the sisters before locking onto their father. It was the Apache Chief, the man whose name had been whispered in the wind for years. No one knew exactly what he wanted or why he had come, but his arrival was anything but ordinary. The chief had a reputation for being a man of few words, and his presence alone carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. His purpose was unclear, but the sisters couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. As they approached him, Clara's heart raced. She had heard the stories, the legends of Apache chiefs and their mysterious ways. Would this be the moment that their family story took a turn they couldn't control? What could this stranger possibly want with them? The chief's voice was calm, yet commanding as he spoke to their father, but his words were cryptic. He spoke of fate, of destiny, and of an inevitable future that would soon unfold. The sisters exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. Something told them that this was not just a visit. It was the beginning of something much bigger than they could ever have imagined. The Apache chief stood tall and unyielding, his gaze unwavering as he spoke to their father. His words were not rushed, but measured, each syllable carrying the weight of history. Clara, Grace, and Lily stood off to the side, trying to process the strange presence that had suddenly entered their lives. It was as if the air around them had shifted, becoming heavier, more charged. The chief's voice echoed in their minds as he mentioned destiny, a word they never thought would be part of their reality. Their father, usually the pillar of their world, seemed to shrink before the chief's presence. He nodded quietly, his expression unreadable, as though the chief's words held a meaning only he could fully understand. Clara, always the curious one, wanted to approach, to ask, but she held herself back. It was clear that something momentous was happening, but what? Grace, more reserved than her sisters, stayed silent, her eyes studying the chief, trying to read him, to figure out what he truly wanted. Lily, the youngest, felt an unease building within her chest. She couldn't explain it, but the arrival of the chief made her feel as if the ground beneath her was about to shift. Their father finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "The chief has come to speak of something important," he said, looking toward the girls. "It is not just a visit. It is a turning point for our family." The words hung in the air like a warning, but it was unclear what was meant by it. The chief turned his attention to the girls, his eyes locking onto each of them in turn. His gaze was intense, as if seeing into their very souls. The silence that followed was thick, each sister feeling a strange pull in her chest, as though the fate of their lives was already being decided without their consent. Clara, always the leader, spoke up first, her voice tinged with both defiance and curiosity. "What do you want with us?" she asked, her words sharp, cutting through the tension. The chief did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Grace and Lily. "You will know in time," he said, his voice like the wind, soft yet powerful. "There is much to prepare for, and the time is nearing." His words were cryptic, but they resonated in the air, leaving a trail of unease. The chief's words seemed to stir something deep within the girls, as if they were all suddenly connected to something greater than themselves. It was as if the earth itself had spoken, and they were now bound to a path they hadn't chosen. After a long pause, the chief turned and began to walk toward the barn, his silhouette growing smaller with each step. Their father stood frozen, watching him go, but the girls felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in their hearts. Something was about to change. They just didn't know what. The chief had spoken of destiny, of the path they were all bound to follow. But what did that truly mean? Clara, always the most proactive, turned to her sisters. "We need to figure this out," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. Grace nodded silently, while Lily looked to the ground, lost in her thoughts. The silence between them was heavy, and the air still hummed with the chief's words. They knew the answer wasn't going to be easy to find, but one thing was certain. The world they had known was about to shift, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the sun began to set over the ranch, casting long shadows across the land, the sisters sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The words of the Apache Chief echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of what was to come. Clara's mind raced with questions. What did the chief mean by destiny? What was he preparing them for? Her gaze wandered toward the barn, where the chief had walked after his cryptic words. She wanted to follow him, to understand more, but she knew better than to act impulsively. Her father's silence had spoken volumes. He knew something, but he wasn't ready to share it with them. Grace, ever the quiet one, sat with her arms crossed, staring out over the fields. She was deep in thought, her expression unreadable. Unlike Clara, Grace wasn't sure what to believe. She didn't trust the chief, not completely. There was something unsettling about him, something that didn't sit right with her. The way he spoke, the way he looked at them, it all felt like a game of chess, with each move calculated and deliberate. But what was the game? Lily, the youngest, couldn't hold her thoughts in any longer. She spoke up, her voice trembling. "Do you think he's telling the truth? Do you think something bad is coming?" Clara turned to her sister, her expression softening. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I think we have to prepare for something. He wouldn't have come all this way for nothing." Grace finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't trust him. We don't know who he really is, or what he wants. What if he's not here to help us?" The words hung in the air like a threat, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. It was true. They didn't know anything about the chief, except the stories that had been passed down through the generations. Stories of power, of war, and of destinies intertwined with the land. But none of that was real, not to them. They were just three sisters, living a simple life on a ranch. Nothing more, nothing less. "We can't ignore him," Clara said firmly. "We need to find out more. We need answers." As night fell, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it a sense of unease. The sisters made their way to the barn, the place where their father had spent so many hours working, a place that had always felt like home. But tonight, it felt different. The barn doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing the dim interior. The chief stood in the far corner, his back to them, seemingly lost in thought. He didn't turn around as they entered. "You have questions," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. "And you will find the answers in time." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. "What do you want from us?" The chief finally turned to face them, his eyes piercing in the dim light. "I want nothing from you," he said slowly. "But you are part of something much larger than you realize. Your fate is tied to this land, and to the people who have come before you." The words were cryptic, but they sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She had always known that there was something special about the land they lived on. But this was something beyond her understanding. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The chief's expression remained unchanged. "You are not just daughters of this land. You are its protectors, and soon, you will have to choose which path you will follow." The air in the barn seemed to grow colder, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. The sisters stood frozen, their minds racing, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what the chief was saying. What path? What did it mean to be protectors of the land? They had never imagined their lives would take such a turn, and yet, here they were, standing at the edge of something much greater than they could have ever prepared for. Clara opened her mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. The chief turned and walked toward the barn doors. "The time will come soon," he said over his shoulder, his voice a mere whisper in the growing darkness. "And you will be ready." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving the sisters standing in stunned silence, the weight of his words heavy on their hearts. The next few days were filled with an uneasy stillness. The wind blew fiercely across the plains, but the land felt quiet, almost as if it were waiting for something. Clara, Grace, and Lily spent their time working the ranch, but their minds were elsewhere. Each of them carried the weight of the chief's words in different ways, and none of them could shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change their lives forever. Clara, always the one to take charge, tried to act as if everything was normal. She took on more responsibilities around the ranch, keeping busy with the chores and making sure everything was in order. But inside, she couldn't escape the thought of what the chief had said. She couldn't understand how their lives could be tied to something so much bigger than themselves. The idea of being protectors of the land, of choosing a path, felt like an impossible burden to bear. She wanted to know more, but every time she tried to approach her father, he remained tight-lipped, his gaze distant and troubled. Grace, on the other hand, kept to herself more than usual. She spent long hours in the barn, staring at the old tools and mementos that had been passed down through generations. She found comfort in the familiar, in the things that had always been a part of their life. But even as she tried to keep herself busy, the chief's words haunted her. She wasn't sure if she believed in the prophecy, but something about it felt real. She had always been cautious, and the idea of choosing a path, one that could affect the entire family, was terrifying. What if they chose wrong? What if the land they had always loved turned against them? Lily, the youngest, struggled with the uncertainty more than her sisters. She was scared, but she couldn't bring herself to talk about it. She kept her fears bottled up inside, hiding them behind a brave face. She didn't want to seem weak, especially not in front of her sisters, who always seemed so much stronger. But deep down, Lily felt lost. She didn't know what path the chief had spoken of, and she had no idea how to prepare for it. The uncertainty weighed on her, and she often found herself gazing out across the vast fields, wondering what the future held. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara finally had enough. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. She gathered her sisters and led them to the barn, the same place where they had confronted the chief. As they walked inside, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew they had to face whatever was coming head-on. The barn was empty, save for the remnants of their family's past, the tools, the hay, the scent of leather and wood. Clara took a deep breath and turned to her sisters. "We need to talk to him," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt. Grace looked at her with wide eyes, but Clara could see the hesitation in her sister's gaze. "Are you sure?" Grace asked quietly. "What if he's not who we think he is?" Clara nodded. "We won't. No, unless we ask. We need answers. We can't keep living like this, wondering what's coming next." Lily, who had been silent up until this point, spoke for the first time. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice small but firm. "I want to know what's happening. I want to understand what we're supposed to do." Clara's heart swelled with pride at her sister's bravery. "We'll figure it out together," she promised. With newfound resolve, the sisters set out to find the Apache Chief. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they couldn't ignore the path that was unfolding before them. The chief had spoken of destiny, of a fate that was tied to the land. But what did it all mean? And how would they prepare for a future they hadn't chosen? The questions loomed large, but one thing was certain. Their journey was only just beginning. The next morning, as the sun rose over the plains, the sisters were already on their way. They had decided to find the Apache Chief, to demand answers and seek clarity on what their future held. The weight of the previous days hung heavily on them, but they knew they couldn't go on living in uncertainty. The air was crisp, the morning dew still fresh on the grass, and the horizon seemed endless. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clara, as always, led the way, her determined stride cutting through the land like the wind itself. Grace followed behind, her expression still wary but resolute. Lily, though still anxious, walked alongside her sisters, her nerves tempered by the unity they shared. The chief had said they would find answers in time, but they weren't willing to wait any longer. They couldn't let fear dictate their lives. After a long day of traveling across the rugged terrain, they finally reached the Apache Chief's camp, hidden deep in a narrow valley that seemed untouched by time. The camp was sparse, with a few simple structures built from wood and stone, blending seamlessly into the natural landscape. The fire was still smoldering from the night before, sending up small puffs of smoke into the clear sky. The chief was there, sitting by the fire, his back straight, his eyes focused on the flames. He didn't look up as they approached, but there was no need for words. He knew they were coming. Clara stepped forward first, her voice steady as she spoke. "We've come for answers. We need to understand what you meant by protectors of the land. What is our role in all of this?" The chief remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his response. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and deep, carrying the weight of years of knowledge. "The land is not just dirt and stone," he said slowly. "It is alive. It breathes, it speaks, and it remembers. The ancestors of your people knew this, and so must you. Your connection to the land is stronger than you realize." Clara frowned, trying to make sense of his words. "But what does that have to do with us? What do you want us to do?" The chief's gaze shifted to her, his eyes intense, almost piercing. "You are the guardians of the land, whether you accept it or not. You have inherited the responsibility to protect it from those who would harm it, to defend its spirit and its future." Grace's voice trembled as she spoke, her doubts bubbling to the surface. "We're just ordinary people. How can we possibly be the guardians of the land? What if we fail?" The chief's expression softened ever so slightly. "You are not ordinary. You are the descendants of those who walked this earth long before you, those who knew the land's secrets. It is in your blood, in your bones. The path ahead will not be easy, but you will not walk it alone. The spirits of your ancestors are with you, guiding you." Lily, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "How do we know we're ready? How do we know what to do?" The chief stood, his towering figure casting a long shadow over them. "You will know," he said simply. "When the time comes, the land will speak to you. Trust in it, and trust in yourselves. That is all you need to know." Clara looked at her sisters, the weight of the chief's words sinking in. They weren't ready, not in any traditional sense. But they didn't have a choice. The path was set, and they had to walk it. They had been chosen, not by the chief, but by something much older, much more powerful than any of them could understand. Clara nodded, a silent promise forming in her heart. "We will do what we must," she said quietly. The chief gave a single nod in return, his expression unreadable. "Then you are ready." With those final words, he turned and walked back into the heart of his camp, leaving the sisters standing in the quiet valley. The air was still, but it felt different now. It felt charged, alive with possibility. Clara, Grace, and Lily exchanged glances, the uncertainty of the past few days replaced by a new understanding. They had their answers, but the true journey was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but also with a growing sense of purpose. The sisters had learned from the Apache Chief that their path was not something that could be predicted or controlled, but it was theirs to walk nonetheless. They spent more time together, working the ranch and preparing for whatever lay ahead. Clara, ever the leader, took charge of the day-to-day tasks, ensuring that their lives continued as normally as possible. But even she could not shake the feeling that something was coming, a moment when the land would speak to them, when the destiny the chief had spoken of would become clear. Grace, though quiet and reserved, found herself thinking more deeply than usual. She had always been the one to keep her emotions in check, but the chief's words had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. What if they weren't strong enough to protect the land? What if the weight of the responsibility was too much for them to bear? Still, she didn't voice these fears to her sisters. She kept them hidden, just as she always had. Lily, the youngest, struggled with her own uncertainty. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a great precipice, unsure whether to step forward or turn back. The idea of being protectors of the land felt like an overwhelming burden, one that she wasn't sure she could carry. But as time passed, she found herself drawing strength from her sisters. Together, they would face whatever was coming. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the air turned cool, the land spoke to them. They were in the fields, gathering hay, when they heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It wasn't thunder, for the sky was clear. It wasn't the wind, for there was no breeze. It was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful. The sisters stopped in their tracks, fear and awe mixing in their hearts. Clara looked at Grace and Lily, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace nodded, her face pale. "It's like the land is alive." Lily's heart raced as she looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had heard stories from her father about the land's power, but she had never believed them. Until now. The rumbling grew louder, and they could feel the ground beneath their feet trembling. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. Something ancient and powerful was awakening. Clara stepped forward, her mind racing. "We need to go to the barn," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. The barn was where everything had begun, where the Apache Chief had first spoken to them. It felt like the right place to go now, the place where they would find the answers they sought. As they ran toward the barn, the rumbling intensified. It was as if the earth itself was guiding them, urging them forward. When they reached the barn, they found that the door was already open, as if waiting for them. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with energy, the air heavy with the sense of something momentous about to happen. The chief was there, standing in the center of the barn, his face calm but serious. "The time has come," he said, his voice low but powerful. The sisters approached, their hearts racing with anticipation. "What do we do now?" Clara asked, her voice firm despite the uncertainty. The chief's gaze swept over them, his eyes filled with something that seemed both ancient and knowing. "You are ready," he said. "The land has spoken. Now, it is time for you to take your place as its guardians. You must protect it from those who would harm it, and from those who would seek to destroy what is sacred." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The sisters stood frozen, the weight of the chief's words sinking in. They had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, they felt both fear and resolve. They had been chosen, and with that realization came the knowledge that their lives would never be the same again. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity. The sisters had been told they were the protectors of the land, that they were to defend it from harm. But how could they even begin to understand what that meant? They had always lived simple lives on the ranch, working the fields and caring for the animals. Now, everything had changed. Clara, still the most determined, spent her time learning as much as she could. She talked to their father, who seemed more distant than ever, and spent long hours studying the old books that had been passed down through generations. But no matter how much she read, she could not find answers to the questions that plagued her. What was she supposed to protect the land from? And how would they know when the time had come to act? Grace, who had always been the more cautious of the three, struggled to come to terms with the weight of their new responsibility. She found it hard to believe that they, just three sisters, could protect the vast land that stretched before them. It was too much, too overwhelming. She often retreated into the quiet of the barn, seeking solace in the familiar scent of hay and leather. But even there, she could feel the weight of the chief's words pressing down on her. She knew that they had been chosen, but what if they were not enough? What if they failed? Lily, still young and uncertain, was unsure how to even begin. She spent her days trying to help her sisters, but a part of her still longed for the simplicity of the life they had known. She missed the days when their biggest concern was whether the cattle had enough water or whether the crops would yield enough to get them through the winter. But now, those worries seemed small and insignificant. The earth was calling to them, and they could no longer ignore it. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set and the air grew cooler, the sisters gathered in the barn, as they had so many times before. But this time, it was different. The air felt thick with energy, the kind of energy that seemed to crackle with a force beyond their understanding. Clara looked at her sisters, her face set with determination. "We have to do this," she said, her voice steady. "The land needs us. We can't keep pretending that we're not ready." Grace looked at her, her expression conflicted. "But how do we know what to do? The chief said the land would speak to us, but it hasn't. How are we supposed to protect it if we don't even know what's coming?" Clara paused for a moment, her mind racing. Maybe it's not about knowing exactly what will happen. Maybe it's about being ready to act when the time comes. The chief said the land would speak to us. I believe that. We just have to trust that we'll know when the time is right. Lily, who had been quiet up until then, spoke up, her voice small but firm. What if the land needs us now? What if we don't have time to wait? Clara turned to her sister, her heart swelling with pride. Then we will act. Together. The sisters stood in the barn, facing one another, the weight of their responsibility settling over them. It was no longer a question of whether they were ready. The land had called, and they had no choice but to answer. The chief had told them they were protectors, and now they would begin to understand what that truly meant. The earth was waiting, and it was up to them to defend it, no matter the cost. They had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but they knew they would face them as one. Together, they were stronger than they had ever been before. And together, they would protect the land that had always been their home. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of urgency. The sisters had made their decision. They would stand together and protect the land, just as the Apache Chief had said. But as they ventured deeper into this unknown path, the reality of what that meant began to settle in. They weren't sure where to start, or what exactly they were supposed to be guarding against, but one thing was certain. The land was watching them, and they had to be ready. Clara led the way as usual, taking charge with the same determination that had always defined her. She spent hours out in the fields, inspecting the crops, the fences, and the animals. There was something in the air that felt different now, like the land was alive, and every change was being noticed. She couldn't explain it, but she felt connected to the earth in a way she never had before. Grace, ever the skeptic, had a harder time embracing this new reality. While she supported her sisters, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were rushing into something they didn't fully understand. She spent long hours thinking, her mind turning over the chief's words, trying to make sense of them. But no matter how hard she tried, there were too many questions without answers. What exactly was their role as protectors? What danger was the land facing that they needed to defend it from? And how would they know when the time came to act? Lily, still struggling with her fear, had begun to see things differently. She had always been the most hesitant of the three, but there was something about the way Clara and Grace had embraced their new purpose that made her feel like she could do the same. She found herself working alongside them, gathering the crops, mending the fences, and watching the land for signs of anything unusual. The more she worked, the more she felt a quiet strength building inside her. But still, there was an undercurrent of fear that they weren't prepared, that they might fail. One evening, as the sun began to set and the land bathed in a golden light, the sisters gathered near the old oak tree that stood on the edge of the property. It had been a place of refuge for them as children, a place to seek comfort when things seemed difficult. Now, it felt like the perfect spot to come together, to think, and to share their thoughts. "We can't keep waiting," Clara said, her voice steady but with a trace of urgency. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here and hope that the land will speak to us. We need to take action, now." Grace looked at her, her brow furrowed. "But what do we do? The chief said the land would speak to us, but what if we don't hear it? What if we're not ready?" Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I don't know exactly what to expect, but I know that we can't just wait for something to happen. We have to prepare ourselves, and we have to trust that when the time comes, we'll know what to do." Lily, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "I think Clara's right. The land has given us a responsibility, and we can't back down now. We might not know exactly what's coming, but we know that we need to be ready." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was a deep silence between them. The land around them seemed to listen, the wind rustling through the leaves of the oak tree. Clara's heart raced, but she knew in that moment that her sisters were with her, and they would face whatever came together. Just as they were about to speak again, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the air. The ground beneath their feet trembled ever so slightly. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't thunder, it was something else, something more primal, like a warning. Clara's eyes widened as she looked at Grace and Lily. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice tense. Grace nodded, her face pale. "It's like the earth is shaking." Lily looked around nervously, her hand instinctively clutching the strap of her jacket. "What is it?" she whispered. Clara took a step forward, her eyes scanning the horizon. The rumbling grew louder, and the air grew thick with tension. The sisters exchanged a glance, and in that moment, they knew that whatever they had been waiting for had arrived. They had been chosen to protect the land, and now it was time to act. Clara turned to her sisters, her face set with resolve. "It's time," she said quietly. We're ready. Together, they made their way back to the heart of the ranch, knowing that their journey was about to take a new turn. The land had spoken, and now they had to listen. The rumbling continued as Clara, Grace, and Lily made their way toward the heart of the ranch, their steps quickening with each passing moment. The land seemed to call to them, urging them forward, and they felt an undeniable pull, a sense that their time had finally come. The air was thick with tension, the very ground beneath their feet trembling with the anticipation of what was to come. As they approached the barn, they could see the faint glow of a fire in the distance, flickering in the evening light. The chief was there, standing near the flames, his back turned to them. It was as if he had been waiting for them all along. Clara's heart raced as she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear building within her. We're here, she said, her words carrying a weight that felt almost unnatural. The chief turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a look of quiet understanding. He said nothing at first, merely nodding in acknowledgement. But there was something in his gaze, something that told Clara they had reached the moment of truth. The chief motioned for them to come closer, and they obeyed, standing before him, the firelight casting shadows across their faces. The time has come, he said, his voice low and calm. You have prepared yourselves, and now the land will test you. What you do next will define your legacy. Are you ready to take on the responsibility that has been placed upon you? Clara nodded, her voice unwavering. We're ready. We've known this moment was coming, and we're not turning back. Grace and Lily stood beside her, their presence silent but strong. The chief's gaze moved over them, his eyes softening just slightly. Remember, he said, his voice carrying a weight of wisdom, you are not alone in this. The spirits of the land are with you, and so are the ancestors who have walked before you. They will guide you if you listen. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the earth, the sweet smell of the grass, and something more, a promise. The ground beneath them seemed to hum with energy, as if the very soil was alive with purpose. Clara could feel it now, the connection to the land stronger than ever before. It wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, and they were a part of it. With a deep breath, Clara turned to her sisters. Let's do this, she said, her voice filled with determination. Together, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The chief watched them silently as they approached the edge of the land, the place where the earth seemed to meet the sky. The wind howled around them, but there was no fear in their hearts. They had accepted their fate, and with it came the strength to protect the land they had always loved. As they stood there, facing the vast expanse before them, Clara's mind raced with everything they had learned. This was their purpose, protecting the land, defending it from those who would seek to destroy what was sacred. They were the guardians now, the keepers of something far greater than themselves. The wind whispered through the trees, and Clara could almost hear the voices of their ancestors, calling to them. The earth was alive with energy, and Clara felt it pulse through her veins. It was time to act. The chief's voice echoed in her mind. You are the protectors. The time is now. Clara, Grace, and Lily stood together, their hearts united, their resolve unwavering. They were ready to face the challenges ahead, to defend the land and everything it stood for. And as they looked out over the land they had sworn to protect, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it as one. They had been chosen, and together, they would honor their destiny. The land was in their hands, and they would not let it fall. They were the guardians now, and they would stand firm in their purpose, no matter the cost.